morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Delia Claiborne Buckner, Simon Buckner's second wife. I was born and raised in Virginia, but we now live in I'm sorry, I just went blank. We now live in Munfordville. Simon and I have been traveling now for the whole year, doing things for different people, explaining some of his life and times. But for us, this year is 1912. So try to pretend of what it was like in 1912. I now present my husband, former General, former Governor, Simon Bolivar Buckner.
Thank you, Delia. Thank you. It's real refreshing to see people coming to listen to what I have to say. When I was a soldier, they had to listen to me. They were orders. When I was governor, I had a legislature didn't want me to say anything. So this is a refreshing thing. First of all, I've seen a lot of things. I was the editor of the Louisville Courier for a year. Now, what happened was it merged with the Pro-Northern Journal. And I did not want to work under Prentice or Watterson. So that's why I was only the editor for a year. I resigned from that position, but I have sold real estate. I have sold insurance. I've done just about everything. And a newspaper man is one of the main things. And because of that, I keep up with the news. Got a lot of inventions coming around. They've got these gas buggies, horseless carriages things. And then they got these airplanes flying around. And the theaters have gotten these flickers now. Flickers. Magic lantern shows. And I'm a big fan of William S. Hart. I love going to those. They're very interesting. I understand in California, Kentucky, a named Griffin is making one of them motion pictures, portraying the war and using actual veterans in the battle scenes. I wish I could go out and be in it. But anyway, with all these inventions, the automobile probably is the biggest thing. But after I left Frankfurt, Delia said, Simon, we need an automobile. And I said, no, Delia. I've lived my whole life with horses. We don't need an automobile. If we have to go a long way, we can get a train. Don't need an automobile. But Simon, you are the governor. You need to lead the way for modernization. Well, you know what happens when husbands and wives disagree. It goes back and forth, back and forth. And the only way to solve it is to compromise. So Delia and I compromised on this issue. Compromise was I bought her an automobile.
And I learned how to drive it.
She did. So anyway, there's a lot of industrialization. England invented or built a steamship. That's the fastest, most luxurious, most beautiful steamship to ever sail the water. It started out across the Atlantic, hit an iceberg, and went to the bottom, and that's all the newspapers are talking about. I'm glad when we went to Europe, I took Bolivar, our son, and Delia, and took my grandson as well. And we went to Europe, toured all the countries, saw all the crowned heads. Had a wonderful time. A guy named Kaiser Wilhelm was making a speech. And I told Bolivar, I said, that guy's going to stir up some trouble. And it sounds like he's doing it by reading the newspapers now. And Simon, of course, is a graduate of West Point, and I hope he doesn't get involved in it. It's going to be something. But anyway, we came home, and this year made me very grateful that we went in 1900 instead of this year. There's our picture on top of the Eiffel Tower. But if we'd have gone this year, Delia would have insisted on us sailing on the biggest, most luxurious, and fastest ocean liner on the water. We dodged a bullet. So anyway, I was born in Hart County, Kentucky, 8 miles from Mumfordville. My father had this house built, which he called the Glen. And it was built by slave labor. Now, I know I was a general in the Southern Army, but slavery just wasn't something that I thought was right. Maybe because when I grew up here at Glen Lily, my only playmate was a son of one of my father's chattels, Shelbourne Matthews. We grew up together, we swam together, we hiked together, hunted and fished together. And we were tight. At the age of 9, my father decided he'd send me to Mumfordville Seminary to start a formal education. So I jumped on a horse and prepared for the 8-mile ride. And Shelbourne jumped up behind the saddle. He said, "I'm going with you. I is your bodyguard." Well, I couldn't argue because slavery and this never was an issue with me and Shelbourne. So we went to Mumfordville. And there we stayed at the home of Tom Woods, a fellow who's going to wear blue in the unpleasantness. Many friends fought against each other in that war. And Tom Woods was one of them. And we went to the seminary. Back then, churches ran the schools too. And we got our formal education and a diploma. But Shelbourne, well, the slaves weren't allowed to be formally educated. He did not get a diploma, but he got an education, and he later became the foreman of my family farm in Arkansas, and also the supervisor of the iron furnace. So a couple of months ago, I heard from Shelbourne in Arkansas, where he still worked for the family. And he said, "Governor, I'd like to come back home for a visit." I said, "Well, certainly." And I sent him the means and tickets, and transportation on the river boat and the trains. And I picked him up at the depot at Cub Run and brought him out and we stayed 2 weeks, and Delia kept the cold lemonade coming. And we had a good visit. Now, after the visit was over, it's time for him to go back. I called to have a photographer come down from Bowling Green to take a picture of us. We hadn't seen each other since we were 17, and here we were in our late 80s. So here's the photograph of me and Shelbourne, and it was taken right about there in front of the Glen. Now, after I inherited the family workplace, I renamed it. We had a daughter named Lily, and I named the farm Glen Lily, honor of my daughter. So that was an interesting thing. That picture still hangs on the wall in our home there at Mumfordville, and I sent a copy of it to Shelbourne. Shelbourne sent me a letter back, and he said, "Governor, we sure do look good, but I's the handsomest." I guess we're still kids at heart. But anyway, he's a good friend, he still is, and always will be. But you know, it's kind of unusual. I did fight for the South, and I did it without believing in slavery. And a smart alecky reporter came down from Chicago to interview me when I was running for governor. He said, "Why do you want to be the leader of a state that you invaded with an army twice?" I said, well, I'm not invading Kentucky. I'm coming to liberate it from an oppressive government. And that was why. And so that's just another part of the story, I guess. But anyway, we moved to Hopkinsville and carried on my education at the Hopkinsville Seminary. And then at the age of 17, I got my appointment to go to West Point Military Academy. And off I went. And while I was there, I made a lot of friends, and most of them was going to be wearing blue in a few years while I wore gray. I always thought that's kind of funny. I got along with the enemy soldiers a whole lot better than I did the ones that was wearing a uniform like mine, as we're going to find out. But at being 17 years old, we like to give each other nicknames. Obviously, they called me Buck. Not Bucky. Nothing. Buck. And then we had George McClellan. Oh, he had the ambition of Napoleon, so we called him Little Mac. And so, I mean, it went on down the line. Jeb Stewart, yeah, we gave him J.E.B. That was the initials of his name. Came Jeb Stewart. And one of the most contrary ones was a fellow that was in a class ahead of me. And he would go on to receive the surrender of the Confederate Army in Virginia and be President of the United States for 8 years. Ulysses Simpson Grant is what you know him as, but that wasn't his name. It was Hiram Ulysses Grant. And the West Point policy was that whenever you enrolled at the academy, you would use your first name, your mother's maiden name, and then the last name. So he wouldn't tell anybody that the S stood for Simpson. He thought that just wasn't military. So we had to get something that starts with an S to call him. We went over everything. So we ended up just calling him Sam. Sam Grant. We became close friends at one time. He was unable to pay his motel bills. Now people say I loaned him money, but I didn't. What I did, I extended a line of credit. And to cover the bills until he could get the money to pay for it. He never forgot that. Well, we graduated from the Point, went off to Mexico to fight in that war. And down there, I met one of the greatest nemesis that was going to plague my years from that point on. There was one of the staff officers who disagreed with everything General Scott wanted to do. He thought he could run the war better than him. His name was Gideon Pillow. Gideon Pillow was so insubordinate they brought charges against him and he resigned rather than face charges. So anyway, Grant was down there. We tried to climb the mountain there outside Mexico City. Grant made it halfway up and went down. But I made it to the top. I was pretty vigorous back in those days. Well, after the war with Mexico was over, we all came home. And my first wife, Mary Kingsbury, we had been blessed with a daughter we named Lily, which in turn aimed at Glenn Lilly. Well, we decided that moving around from military post to military post was no way to raise a daughter. So I resigned from the Army and we settled in Louisville. There, Governor McGoffin made me co-commander of the Kentucky State Guard, the militia, along with another good friend, Thomas Crittenden, whose father was a senator. Probably the best friend I've ever had, and he would also wear blue. Well, as a commander of the state guard, I was Governor McGoffin's go-to feller when he wanted something done. So he declared neutrality for Kentucky. We're not going to take part in either side. So Governor McGoffin sent me to Washington to get this guarantee from Mr. Lincoln. And that's a very, Delia, she's an unreconstructed rebel. And she refers to him as that man. Still, nothing to do with it. But anyway, I went to Washington. Finally got to see him after waiting for 2 weeks. And I got his guarantee that his government would not violate Kentucky's neutrality. So I came back and reported. And then McGoffin sent me to Tennessee to get the same guarantee from the governor of Tennessee. And when I got down there, I was met with somebody in the gallant uniform of the Confederacy with more gold braid than a pope. Gideon Pillow. Well, he wanted to be the one to negotiate with Kentucky's stand. And I said, no, Gideon, I want to talk to the governor. And he just raised a fit. And finally, I ignored him in the room and I talked directly to the governor. I wasn't making a good friend there. But anyway, we got the guarantee, and by the time I got back to Frankfort, Mr. Lincoln's government had set up recruiting stations in Kentucky. Camp Dick Robinson was organized. Sam Grant had moved into Paducah. And the Confederates, of course, responded by moving into Kentucky along the southern border. Well, I was trying to make up my mind if I was going to go the way of my friends and wear the blue or wear the gray. But when I got back to Louisville, I saw Lincoln soldiers all over the place. And I saw my friends who were Southern sympathizers, and they were being dragged through the streets in chains, humiliated, land confiscated, and put into prison. See, Lincoln took away the writ of habeas corpus, which means he can charge anybody with whatever he wanted to without cause. And I thought that was robbing us of our constitutional rights. And I cannot support a government that would take away Kentucky's constitutional rights. So I made up my mind and offered my services to Richmond. We had to sneak out of Louisville because Louisville was a Union town. We went by horse down to Shepherdsville, and there we boarded the train and headed for Bowling Green. Now, General Albert Sidney Johnson was the commander of the Confederates in the West, and I offered my services to him, and he put me in charge of Kentucky. And thus began another phase of my life, and I guess I better change hats. This is what I wore as a commander of the State Guard. And so down there in Bowling Green, we held our own. My patrols and cavalry went all the way north to Louisville. No sign of Union troops. And then General Zollicoffer crossed the river, Cumberland River in Pulaski County and fought the Battle of Mill Springs and got himself killed. Well, that broke that defense line, so the whole thing moved from Kentucky down to Tennessee. So we had to retreat, and Nashville was now the center of the line. At that time, then General Johnson ordered me to go to Fort Donelson, which was the western anchor of the Confederate battle line to defend Kentucky. I took with me the 3rd Kentucky, which was a part of the State Guard that went south with me. They became the 1st Kentucky Brigade. Of course, now they're proud to call themselves the Orphan Brigade. But the 3rd Kentucky went with me to Donelson. We got down there and we set up. General Pillow was the commander. I was 3rd in command. 2nd in command and over me was Gideon Pillow. Wasn't glad to see that man. But he was an officer over me, and I had to follow his orders. Didn't like it, but he went out of his way to put me in harm's way. I controlled the western flank of the fortifications protecting Donelson, and I attacked Sam Grant's army, drove them back a mile, and Pillow ordered us to move back to our trenches again. I said, oh, how many times we had to fight for the same real estate, but he was trying to make me look bad. So anyway, this went on for a week or so, and then Pillow and Floyd decided they wanted to break out and go around the right flank of the Union Army and push them out of the way and open up the road so they can evacuate and go to Nashville. We called a meeting in the Dover House Hotel right on the river. And Floyd passed the command down to Pillow. Pillow passed it on to me, and both of them agreed, said, we cannot be captured by the Union forces. We are the most prominent men in the Confederate Army, and they would surely hang us. Well, I accepted the command, and I started negotiating with Sam for surrender of our forces. Unconditional surrender. So now U.S. had stood for something else. So we were going to be sent to northern prisons until still exchanged. But the day after the formal surrender, I met with Sam on his headquarters on an armored gunboat there at the landing. The war wasn't going on in that meeting. We were old friends meeting again. He apologized for me having to go to a prisoner of war camp, and he offered his purse to me to take care of my needs. Of course, he was trying to return the favor done at West Point, and I turned it down. We didn't need it. And I told him what Pillow and Floyd said about them not wanting to be captured because they were most important Confederates in the Army. And he couldn't help but laugh. He knew about Pillow and Floyd before I did. So we had a good laugh about it. And he said, no, I would have turned them loose. They're the greatest asset the North has. So anyway, that ended their military career. Both of them resigned under pressure. And after I spent 6 months in the northern prison, I was exchanged and came back and I got a promotion. So I'm known for surrendered Donelson. Of course, I was forced to, because we were outnumbered something like 10-1 by Sam's army. And if I stood there, my men would be slaughtered. And I put my army ahead of everything else. So we surrendered, and I went to Fort Warren, which was in Boston Harbor. After 6 months there, I was exchanged, and I came back to Richmond. General Lee wanted me to lead a brigade in his army, which I was more than willing to do. But Braxton Bragg and President Davis were good friends, and he, because of his action at Shiloh, he got commander of the Confederate Army. And he wanted me to come back to the West, which I had to do. When I got back, the Battle of Shiloh had been fought, and Bragg, the hero of that battle, I suppose, was now planning an invasion of Kentucky. Now, the previous August, the end of August, General Edmund Kirby Smith had invaded Kentucky from Knoxville. And he encountered the Union forces south of here and fought all across these fields up through here, fought around this building, and he got the most decisive Confederate victory of the war. And he controlled central Kentucky, including the capital and Lexington and the Bluegrass. By that time, Bragg was leaving Chattanooga, and we didn't get up here until October. Last of September, 1st of October. And Buell, another Union general, another hero of Shiloh. All them Union boys got to be heroes after Shiloh. And it was a race for Louisville. And Buell was right behind us, and we were leading. We were winning the race. And we got to Munfordville, which was my hometown. And the advance of Bragg's army, the Army of Mississippi as it was known then, just charged in, charged the fortifications. And that made Bragg mad. Now, Bragg was not a popular feller. Strict disciplinarian. And he hated Kentuckians. He sent the Orphan Brigade to Louisiana. He said, if we get them back to Kentucky, they'll desert and we'll never see them again. Of course, we know that's not true. It wouldn't happen. So we got to Munfordville, and Bragg got angry because his men attacked those fortifications at Munfordville, protecting the Green River Bridge, don't you see? So it made him mad, and he says, all right, we're going to kill every Union soldier there, and I'm going to burn the town down. I said, no, wait a minute, this is my hometown. I can't be a part to that. If I can get Wilder to surrender, will you not burn the town? And he agreed to it. So I was in my headquarters, I sent a message, and Wilder, who was not a West Point man, he was a businessman who got an appointment in the Union Army. And he got a position behind the lines where the war would never reach him, they thought. So he was brought blindfolded to my tent. He said, I've heard of your reputation, General Buckner. What do you think I should do? Well, I thought I'd made myself clear that I wanted him to surrender. But I said, this is a decision you've got to make. So I told that young man, says, well, let me take you on a tour of our lines, and then you decide if you want to fight or not. So he counted infantry here in this trench, counted the cannons here, counted the infantry here, and he found out we outnumbered him something like 10-1. Now, some people have later said that I pulled a fast one, and he's counting these, and he's counting these. We move these over here to be counted again. I wouldn't do a thing like that. Now, Nathan Bedford Forrest might, but not me. But nevertheless, he said, I think it is best for my force to surrender. He surrendered. We paroled him, put him on a train bound for Louisville. And we avoided a big battle at that point. I saved my hometown. But that'll probably never be known. We went on, and we were still ahead on the race to Louisville, and then Bragg ordered us to make a right turn and head over to Bardstown, allowing Buell to get to Louisville first. Well, by now, we were well aware of Kirby Smith's actions in these fields. And here in October, it was a drought in Kentucky, kind of like hot like it is now. And water was as valuable as a wagon train of ammunition. So Bragg, he wanted to fight up around Harrodsburg. Buell, well, he didn't know where he was, much less where he wanted to fight. But he just came out of Louisville looking for us and bumbling around, and the armies kind of ran into each other at Chapman River that runs through the little town of Perryville. And there the battle opened. They brought in reinforcements from behind the lines. And before you know it, about just before noon, we had a full-fledged battle going. And neither Buell nor Bragg even knew that their armies were in a battle, because there was like an atmospheric canopy over the battlefield at Perryville, and the sound would just bounce back. And a mile away, you couldn't hear the cannons. So finally, they got word that their armies were in battle. Now, I was in Hardee's Corps, commanding a division. And we were on the Confederate left flank, and we started moving forward. Fought along the bottom house, on up the hill. We had a couple of regiments that we'd already sent to charge against that hill. And they didn't do very well. But by going up on their flank, through the bottom farm and the farmhouse and the barn, they slowly began to give up real estate and fall back. So we moved that hill, turned their own cannon on them, and continued. And finally, when the sun went down, we were at Dick's Crossroads. Union Army was torn apart, and we were eager to finish our victory. But Bragg said, halt for the night. And he said worse than that. He ordered a retreat. Now, that's something Bragg liked to do. He would win battles and then he'd order a retreat. After spending all those lives to win a battle, he ordered a retreat. We argued with him, but it was to no avail. The retreat was ordered, and we went back to Danville, went down the Wilderness Road, and headed back for Cumberland Gap. Nobody was madder than Kirby Smith, because he had conquered Kentucky. Before that battle opened up, we all got together in Frankfort to install a Confederate governor. And Buell's forces started lobbing cannonballs in and interrupted the celebration. But Kirby Smith and his victorious army also had to retreat. When we got to the Cumberland Gap, the Orphan Brigade had been using everything possible to get up here. They wanted to come back to Kentucky. And we met them at Cumberland Gap, and they joined the retreat back to Knoxville. Well, when it got down there, we argued with Bragg. We argued with Richmond, Virginia. We argued with President Davis. Relieve this man. And he didn't like all the opposition to him. So he got me transferred to Mobile, Alabama to supervise construction of earthworks protecting that harbor. And then while I was down there, Bragg then met against General Rosecrans at Murfreesboro, what's called the Battle of Stones River. And there the Orphan Brigade really showed its glory. After fighting for 2 days, Bragg ordered a retreat after we had won. We had pushed the Union Army back against itself. And General Breckinridge said, "We've won a battle, General Bragg. Don't retreat." He said, "Well, if you think that you've won so good, why don't you take these precious Kentuckians of yours and charge the Union left flank? Drive them from the field." Okay. General Breckinridge accepted it. And they moved out across the open fields, under cannon fire, across Stones River, across another field, and up the hill to every cannon the Union Army had on top of the hill. The Orphan Brigade suffered close to 50% casualties. When they came back, General Breckinridge rode to meet them, and he said, "My poor orphans, what have they done to you?" Thus, 1st Kentucky Brigade became famous as the Orphan Brigade. Well, I wasn't with them then, but I got back from Mobile. Soon after that, and General Rosecrans had tricked Bragg back into Chattanooga, and worse than that, south of Chattanooga into North Georgia. And while we were down there, we was waiting for Rosecrans to attack. And Richmond, Virginia decided they'd send a part of Lee's army over to show us Westerners how to fight. Sent Longstreet's corps over. As they arrived from the south by the train from Atlanta, General Rosecrans heard those trains and he said, they're getting reinforced on their left flank. So he said, take part of the soldiers and put them on the left flank. Now, that was Thomas Woods, the one I went to the seminary with. And he withdrew and left a big gap in the Union lines and went down and reinforced at Lee and Gordon's Mills. About that time, Longstreet's corps was taking its place, and he said, okay, let's show them how to fight. And they charged the center and poured right through that big gap, rolled the Union Army up in two ways, and sent them retreating back into Chattanooga. We had won a decisive victory, but Bragg wouldn't hear of it. He said, I'm not so sure. I think we ought to retreat. We argued with him. His whole staff argued with him on this, but he would not listen. And finally we convinced him, after he had divided us up, he sent Longstreet to Knoxville to try to knock Thomas out of that place. And then he spread his lines thin along Missionary Ridge and then by Lookout Mountain. And there was a man for every yard, which was not strong enough to hold a battle line. And then when Sam Grant got there, he ordered a charge against, well, he captured Lookout Mountain, and then he ordered a charge up Missionary Ridge. When he did that, the Confederate Army disintegrated and fell back to Dalton. It was humiliating. And Bragg was still saying, these rebels here to the army, boy, what a double innuendo there. And he got me transferred to the Trans-Mississippi, to New Orleans. And then we had the Atlanta campaign, the March to the Sea. And then General Lee surrendered to Sam Grant. A couple weeks thereafter, General Johnson surrendered to General Sherman. And guess who was the only commander with an army of any size left? Once again, I'm faced with the prospect of surrendering. And that's what I'm known for, surrendering. But I think history has misjudged me. It wasn't a surrender out of cowardice. It was a surrender for the sake of my armies. Now, Kirby Smith, that was actually his job to do that surrendering in the Trans-Mississippi, but he had joined other Confederates and went to Mexico and was going to carry on the war from there. So I had to surrender. It was in my parole that I couldn't return to Kentucky for 3 years. But I needed to take care of my family, so I sold insurance for the Globe Insurance Company of New York City. I sold real estate. I wrote articles for the New Orleans Crescent newspaper, which got me into the newspaper business. And finally, my business was expanding out of New Orleans, all directions. So I wrote a letter to Washington, and by now, Grant had become president. So when that letter went up there to the War Department, saying, I need to be able to leave New Orleans to carry on my livelihood. Well, the letter came across Sam's desk. Sam saw what it is, and he said, you let Buck go wherever he wants to go. Well, that was it. We came back to Louisville, set up housekeeping, and then I found out that there was a fellow when I left whose name was William Belknap, the hardware man. And when I left to join the South, William Belknap had confiscated my properties in Louisville, Elizabethtown, and Mumfordville, put a price on my head for treason, and now I got back to Louisville and I had to fight this. My lawyers was George McClellan and Ambrose Burnside, 2 Union officers I had faced in battle that were friends from West Point. Well, they arranged to get my property returned to me, and we kind of negotiated the holdings that I inherited in Chicago, which is now downtown Chicago. Pretty valuable real estate that I had up there. And it was all returned to me. So now we adjusted to civilian life. I'll just leave that off for now. Well, when I got home, I decided I'd dedicate myself to restoring Glen Lily that had come into disrepair over the war years. My daughter Lily and my sister moved to Glen Lily, and we began to repair the farm. My sister passed. And then Lily came to me with the words that no father of a daughter wants to hear. Father, I have met a man who asked to marry him. Now, not being one to break my daughter's heart, I said, well, may I know the name of this man that has captured your heart? She said, his name is Morris. Morris Belknap. By any chance is he related to William Belknap, the hardware man? Yes, that's his father. Do you know him? I said, our paths have crossed. Well, not wanting to break my daughter's heart, I approved and I said, I can avoid William. I'll just avoid him, which I did. And I found out Morris made a pretty good husband, made a pretty good father. Later on, I even supported him politically. So we had a big wedding in Louisville, but I left myself alone at Glen Lily. All I do was just sit up there on the porch right there. Had peacocks, and I watched them roam the grounds. Squirrels jumping in the trees, occasional deer, chickens, the squirrels jumping in the trees, possums, polecats, all kinds of animals, and all I had to do was sit there and watch them. And the squirrels jumping in the trees. I'm 90 years old, and that happens to me sometimes. But I decided that I didn't like me. That's the first time in my life I'd been alone. So I heard of this place in Western Virginia called Greenbrier Hotel at White Sulphur Springs. And there, a lot of the soldiers from both sides were getting together, and people were gathering around them and wanted them to tell their war stories. Figured I'd find a bunch of old friends there, so I caught the train at Mumfordville, went to Nashville, to Knoxville, up the Shenandoah Valley, and then I caught the stagecoach to White Sulphur Springs. Now, people went there for several reasons. One was the sulfur springs that would heal everything from bunions to the measles. Other people went there simply for the fellowship of meeting other people. And other people went there because of this game of chasing a little white ball all over the cow pasture. Now, I never was much for sports. When I got back from Louisiana, I was a commissioner on the board of the Kentucky Agricultural College. Anybody know what that is? Yeah, it's the University of Kentucky now. And once again, sports has plagued the place because they got this guy in Kansas who invented this game of taking a volleyball and bouncing it and then throwing it into a peach basket. And now all the colleges have taken up and they've got teams. So once again, sports instead of education. And of course, I can't stand that. But I don't think anything will come from that game. But anyway, at Greenbrier, it was golf. It had a lot of silly names in that game. Tee off, par, hollering 4 when you're getting ready to hit it. Not always holler back 5. But there was this one guy who played golf 3 times a day at Greenbrier. He was out there one day and he didn't let anything interrupt his game. And he was up there beside the road and he was getting ready to tee off. Now, that's another silly name for a game. That means he's going to knock the ball in the hole from close range. And his funeral procession went by, and he never let anything interrupt his concentration. But when this funeral procession came by, he took his hat off and put his hat back on, went back to what he was doing. His companion said, "Now, all my life of playing golf with you, I've never seen anything interrupt your game. Why did you do that?" Guy just looked at him and said, "I owed her that much. I was married to her 30 years. But people loved the golf game. People loved it. But we sat on the veranda, and this one young lady was sending me a lot of attention. Now, I lost Mary 10 years after the war. But I was there, and every time I looked around, this young lady from Richmond, Virginia was sitting there asking me more questions. And we came back to the Greenbrier several times after that. And finally, we just decided to get married. So I had met Delia. Went to Richmond for one of the biggest funerals, the biggest weddings that the city had ever seen. Former Confederate officers came to our wedding. Now that war was before Delia was born. You see, I was 62 at the time and she was 28. Fine judge of manhood. But anyway, we got married and we went on our wedding trip to Niagara Falls in upstate New York. And when I got up there, I heard that Sam Grant was living at Mount McGregor. And I wished to see him. So I sent a letter to his son, Fred. And he said, "Father would be glad to see you, General Buckner." So Delia and I got on a train. We went down to Mount McGregor. Sam had lost his voice because of his drinking and smoking. He couldn't talk. Throat cancer. And he was writing his memoirs because he wasn't a good businessman and he wanted to pay his debts. He knew that his days were numbered. So we sat on the porch and we visited for about 45 minutes until I noticed that Sam was getting tired. So as we sat there and we got ready to go, he wrote down his end of the conversation on these little pieces of paper. And of course, I would talk. And then something interesting. Delia, tell them about what happened.
It was quite amazing. I really wasn't happy about going to see that ex-Union general that devastated Richmond.
Unreconstructed.
Yeah, always. But we went, and of course he let me see other things, and he let me go shopping, but that's okay. And when Julia and I got together, we actually almost became friends. And Julia gathered up all the notes that Sam had written, gathered them up and put them in this envelope, and gave them to me to keep. Well, now we're pack rats. A lot of people are, but we're definitely pack rats. So I have the original notes in the original little envelope that says Mount McGregor. And I'd like to read this one to you. This is one that I found that I thought was very appropriate. It says, "You look very natural today, Governor, but your hair has gotten white and your hands beginning to shake." And that was the way it was. Thank you.
Thank you, Delia, for relating that. And it was a great sacrifice for her to go visit the home of the Yankee who won the war.
You let me go shopping, so I'll do that.
Let you go shopping. So anyway, we left, and about 2 weeks later, Sam passed away. I got a letter from Fred that he wanted me to be one of the pallbearers, so I went to New York City, marched in the funeral procession down Broadway, and to the tomb that was built for that purpose. And then 2 weeks after that, President Davis passed away, and I was also asked to be a pallbearer there as well. I was getting all kinds of honors here. Now, I failed to show you some of the pictures here. That's Greenbrier. I should have pointed out when I was talking about it. That's Delia and I's wedding pictures. Down here is Lily and Morris. And here we are sitting on the front porch, right there in that corner. That's me, Delia, and Bolivar, which is what we call him. He's Simon Bolivar Buckner Jr. And so we've got pictures, and I thought these pictures might help a little bit. So we finally went home to Glen Lily and continued the restoration of the home place. But Delia had ideas. She wanted a swimming pool. So she had a swimming pool built in front of Glen Lily. She had 4 fountains erected on the grounds.
Running water, too.
And yes, she did. She arranged for running water, a pump at the Buckner Spring, and a reservoir which gravity fed running water in the home. And so all kinds of modern things. Flowers all over the place. Glen Lily never looked so good, I got to admit. So while we were there, we continued this, and then she announced something else that was going to change my life forever. She said, "Simon, you're going to be a father." I said, "Delia, don't you think I'm a little too old for that?" She said, "Apparently not, and it's too late now." So Bolivar was born. Right after that, about a year or so after our marriage. And then the office of governor came up. Delia said, "Simon, Kentucky needs you. Run." I wouldn't have done it if she hadn't insisted. But I ran for governor and I won. You know, after the South lost cause was finally lost, Kentucky joined the Confederacy. Anybody get elected to any office in Kentucky from dog catcher to governor, as I proved. So we moved to Frankfort for the next 4 years. When we got there, we found a lot of problems in Frankfort. First of all, the finances. Kentucky was in debt and getting worse. They had a treasurer there whose name was Honest John Tate. Boy, there was a red flag. When I found out that Kentucky's treasury for running the state for the next week to the title of $475,000.84 was missing. So I said, "Tate, I want you in my office with your books, and we're going to have an auditor there, and we're going to get to the bottom of this." The next day I got there, Tate was nowhere to be found, and he was never seen again. And also gone was $476,000.84. Doesn't take a detective to figure that one out. So anyway, I tried to find out why Kentucky wasn't making money. So I found out that the legislatures were voting bills and putting riders on it that was funneling money into their pockets and to their home districts. And I said, now that's not what you're in public service for. So every time a bill came to my desk, it had the earmarks of graft, I vetoed it. I vetoed over 100 bills from that Congress, more than any governor before or after. They called me the hatchet governor, and I was proud. So I had to fight with that legislature for the whole 4 years. Now, in order to keep somebody from Tate and getting office again, I led the charge to have a bill passed where elected officials cannot secede themselves. Unfortunately, that meant the office of governor as well. So I limited myself to not being able to run for re-election. Then, so after that, I found out another big problem in Kentucky was there was a bunch of families in the mountains that didn't like each other. And there was 8 feuds going on in the mountain counties of Kentucky. There was the, what's that noise? Cricket? So anyway, I got in there and I found out, said we got to gain control of this and stop all this violence. Families killing each other. There was the Howards and the Bakers. They was in Clay County. The Frenches and Eversols and Hazard. And in Breathitt County, everybody was fighting everybody. We simply called it Bloody Breathitt. And so I started sending the state guard, the militia, into these communities and arresting the county governments and said, if you want to control your county back, stop the fighting. Well, that ended out most of them. But one of them was more famous than any of the others, and it was the smallest feud there was. Pike County. Y'all probably know the families. Hatfields and McCoys. Now, I'd promised the McCoys that I would work for them as governor, and they helped me get elected. So they had, Hatfields had crossed the Tug River from West Virginia and burned down Randall McCoy's house, killed 2 of his children, and beat his wife to a pulp. And now they wanted the governor to do something about it. So I sent an emissary, a special investigating officer named Perry Klein, to go and arrest those Hatfields and bring them across the Tug River so they can face justice. And that's what he did. But the governor of West Virginia said, that's illegal. You can't do that. You can't cross state lines and arrest our citizens and bring them back. I said, well, yeah, I can, and I did, and we want you to turn the rest of the Hatfields over to us. And the governor didn't like that. So he sued me, and I sued him back. It went back and forth in the courts. And this is how that feud got famous. There was about 12 killed in that feud in as many years. And these other feuds had killed hundreds and went for generations. But this little feud in the Pike County got to be the most famous of all. That's because whenever it got to the court system of appeals, went all the way to the Supreme Court in Washington. The northern press started interviewing people. They came down and they interviewed these mountain men sitting on their front porches with their hound dogs and their shotguns and their straw hats and their corncob pipes. Well, corncob pipe wasn't such a bad idea. But anyway, they got a reputation and their headlines. Hillbilly feuds in Kentucky. We didn't take too kindly being called hillbillies. Kind of the way I look at it is we can call each other hillbillies, but those Yankees better hush. But that's how we got to be known as hillbillies, because of all those newspaper articles written about that feud. Finally, the Supreme Court decided, Governor Buckner, you do not have the right to send officers into another state and arrest their citizens and bring them back. That's illegal. But since they're in Kentucky, you can arrest them now. Which is what we did. And the Hatfield leadership went to prison, and one was executed, which ended that feud. Well, we gone on for 4 years like that, and the legislature wanted to take one more jab at me. They didn't want me to leave with the budget balanced in the state treasury. So in the last 6 months before it ended in Frankfurt, they cut taxes in half. Well, normally that would be good news to the citizens, but we weren't going to have enough money to run Kentucky for the next 6 months. And I didn't want to go out in debt. So I contacted my representatives in Chicago, and I said, liquidate my property there. So they did, and I got a pretty handsome check out of it. And I loaned it to Kentucky so we could pay our bills for the next 6 months. Kentucky never paid me back. But that's all right. I had my integrity. And that was what I valued the most. So we went back to Glen Lily. And then there was a presidential campaign. And the issue of this thing was money. The Democrats, they wanted to expand money and currency so that silver and gold and notes would be put in circulation. And the Republicans said, no, keep on the gold standard. Well, there's a bunch of us Democrats that agreed with the Republicans that we need to keep gold as a standard. Because if you print twice as much money as we got gold, then that means each dollar is going to be worth 50 cents. Me being a businessman, I thought that was a horrible move. So we organized the Gold Democrats. And John Palmer, a Union general, ran for president, and I was chosen to run for vice president. Now here's the campaign button. We ran, I traveled all over and I became a nationwide name after that. And, but we didn't win. McKinley won. And in 1900, he was assassinated. The fellow became president was Theodore Roosevelt. Now, when I was a governor, Roosevelt was writing a book called The Winning of the West, and he stopped by Frankfurt because I taught history at the Point. And we had a good visit, and we actually became good friends, even though I was a Democrat and he was a Republican. Now that he became president, Dee and I went to Washington and visited him as president of the United States. I mentioned that my son would like to go to West Point. He said, let it be done. So Bolivar got his West Point appointment from the President of the United States, Theodore Roosevelt. So, nevertheless, we get ourselves up to the current days. Now, spend my time mostly at Glen Lily, going to reunions, and just generally touring historic sites like this one. And occasionally I speak to fine groups of people like you. And it's a real pleasure to do that. So I thank you very much for coming, and I appreciate the attention. Thank you. Now, if anybody has any questions, 3 questions already.
And then if you want to ask me something after it's over, after I leave, you can ask me something. Yes, his parents were married when he was born, not necessarily to each other.
Okay, question. Your opinion, sir. I value it highly. All these generals who want to take land and fall back, how different might our world today be had that not occurred? And they went, we'll say, to the Ohio River.
Well, I was pretty favoritely in support of the Confederacy. But, you know, since that war, everything the South was fighting for and everything wanted has just happened. And the causes that started that war, of course, it ended slavery, which I didn't support anyway. But more states' rights was a result of it. And I think it's good that it went the way it did. But at the time, you know, I wanted to win that war. Next question. Did you say you had 3?
Nothing's free. I was giving them 3 chances.
Oh, okay. Any other questions?
So what was your son's military career like?
Well, it's a good one. This is a good question.
Pardon?
What was your son's military career that went to the point?
Well, Bolivar went to West Point when he graduated. I wanted to go to his graduation, and the doctors said, well, Simon, you can't stand that long train trip to West Point, New York. And I said, I have been given commands over men and over a state government, and I'm not going to let doctors tell me what to do. So I got out on the road, and I caught rides, and I made it up there to see my son graduate. Now, we got this war raging up in Europe now, and I kind of regret that decision to push him into a military career. I hope he doesn't get involved in that. Any other questions?
What was your place out in Arkansas, you said, when your best friend was out there and he became a leader later on? What was that about?
I don't recall. But we had a farm in Hopkins County. And then while the war was going on, my father just moved west like a lot of people were doing. And he moved west and started an iron furnace in Arkansas and a farm. And of course, Shelbourne went with him, worked for the family, even after he was a free man. And so I've still got 2 of my sisters that live there and run the farm. And Shelbourne, of course, is in charge. Any other questions?
Is the home place still there?
I can answer that, because he would not know. Little Lily was burned in the 1960s. It had been rented out to a tenant farmer with a lot of signs, original stuff, still in the home. They burned it for the insurance, unfortunately. The only thing that's left is the swimming pool in the front, and there's a smokehouse on the side, and a stile. Does everybody know what a stile is? And for those that don't, it's the steps that were made either out of wood or rock that the women would climb up on to get into their carriages or on top of their horse. And that's the 3 things that are still left at Glen Lubbock.
She's smart. I don't know how she has all these answers.
Whereabouts did you live when you were in Louisville? What part of Louisville?
When I lived in Louisville, well, I bought a house on 6th and Broadway. And about halfway up the block. And of course, Thomas Crittenden, who was the other co-commander of the State Guard, he lived close by, and we got real close. Our wives got close, and he became my closest friend. And when when Thomas was making his stand on Snodgrass Hill at the Battle of Chickamauga, and the Union Army under Rosecrans was falling back into Chattanooga, I looked over there and I saw Thomas Crittenden and his staff riding for the rear. And I actually felt kind of bad about it because that was my friend. I found out later they blamed him and Thomas Wood for the Confederate victory at Chickamauga. And actually it was Rosecrans who sent mistaken orders. But of course that broke him. He got so much pressure, he finally resigned from the Army. And in 1876, he inspired his son to follow a military career. And he would regret that because his son would join with General Custer's 7th Cavalry and go to Montana to fight Indians. And he didn't come back. So my friend Thomas Crittenden suffered a lot of losses because of military. Of course, he regretted sending his son in that direction, and it broke him even more. He wasn't the same man. Any other questions?
Thank you.
Bolivar's son, Buckner's son, did you tell what happened?
We did.
You
We
want
did.
to do it or you want to do it? Why don't you do it?
Okay, I'll answer questions. Exit Simon, enter Don. The question was asked about Bolivar, what happened to him, and you students of history, you know that Bolivar did follow a military career. He was based at home during the First World War. Second World War, he got to the rank of general, and right at the end of the Second World War, he commanded Okinawa right at the gate of Japan. And being that his father, Simon, he believed in leading from the front instead of leading from the rear, Bolivar did the same sort of thing. And he was in the front lines when a Japanese shell came in and killed him at Okinawa. And he's buried in Frankfort Cemetery alongside the governor.
And he's the highest ranking American soldier killed during World War II.
Right. And it was right at the end of the war.
Right? Yeah, inside.